The year 1891 was dying of thirst in Dust Haven, Arizona territory. It was a slow, parched death, written in the fine silt that coated every windowsill and the pale, unforgiving blue of the sky. The wind was the only thing with any life in it, a ceaseless preacher of dust and decay that whipped down the town's single street, rattling the false fronts of the mercantile and the saloon. It made the boards of the Blue Coyote diner groan like an old man settling his bones. The community, well, the town's very heart, beat weaker each day, its water level sinking until the bucket came up more mud than promise. Far off, so distant it felt more like a memory than a fact, a train whistle would sometimes cry out, a thin, metallic sound that spoke of a world with green lawns and running water, a world that had forgotten places like this. Inside the Blue Coyote, the heat was a physical presence, a thick blanket smelling of bacon fat, old coffee, and anxiety. Nora Whitlow felt it pressing on her shoulders as she sliced potatoes, the rhythmic thump of her knife, a small defiance against the silence. At 27, she wore widowhood not as a shroud of black lace, but as a permanent squint against the glare of her reality. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of this diner, to the dwindling sacks of flour and beans, and to the ledger book whose numbers whispered of foreclosure. Her purpose was simple and sharp as a shard of glass: keep this place afloat, keep the bank from her door, and keep her 16-year-old brother, Jamie, from the kind of trouble that festered in the boredom of a dying town. Jamie was wiping down the counter, his movements languid in the afternoon heat. He was a good boy, all arms and legs, and a yearning for something more than the horizon Dust Haven offered. Nora watched him, her heart a tight knot of love and fear. He had his father's honest eyes and his mother's restless spirit, a combination that made her feel a fierce, almost painful need to protect him. A shadow fell across the doorway, momentarily eclipsing the brutal sunlight. The man who stood there was tall and still, built of the same leany, hard materials as the desert itself. Dust clung to his worn trousers and the brim of his hat. He took it off as he stepped inside, revealing dark hair and a face that looked as if it had been carved from rock and left out in the sun. He moved to a small table in the corner, his steps measured and quiet, making hardly a sound on the worn floorboards. Nora felt Jamie's gaze on her, a silent question. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head and walked toward the stranger, a coffee pot in her hand. She asked, "Coffee?" Her voice was low, businesslike. He looked up, and for a moment, his eyes, a startling gray like a storm over the mountains, met hers. They held no warmth, but no malice either. They were simply observant. He said, "Yes, ma'am, and some stew, if you have it." As she poured, her gaze caught on his wrist resting on the table. A pale scar, shaped like a cruel hook, marked his skin. It was an old wound, but it seemed to pull the light into it, a small emblem of some past violence. He was perhaps 33, she guessed, a man who had seen more than he spoke of. He ate his stew with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, his attention on his bowl. Yet Nora felt as though he was aware of every sound in the room, every shift of the wind outside. He paid his bill with the exact change, plus a nickel. Nora looked at the extra coin. "You do not have to do that." He was already putting on his hat. "Think of it as a down payment on peace of mind." He nodded once, a gesture of finality, and was gone, the screen door sighing shut behind him. The nickel felt heavy in her palm. It was more than charity. It was a statement. In a town where every coin was counted and every kindness had a price, it was an anomaly. She dropped it into the pocket of her apron, a small, perplexing weight. This was Cole Maddox, though she did not know his name yet. He had been a scout, his eyes trained to read the subtle language of a bent twig or a disturbed patch of earth. Later, he had worked for the Pinkerton Agency, a job that had taught him to read men, a far more treacherous terrain. He had left that life behind after a case in Colorado went bad, leaving 3 men dead and a hole in his soul. The scar on his wrist was from that time, a physical reminder of a debt he felt was still owed. A blood debt. Dust Haven was not a place men like Cole Maddox came to by accident. He had followed a cold trail here, a trail that led to the town's undisputed king, Judge Luther Pike. The judge owned the biggest cattle ranch, the most land, and through his bank, he owned most of the people. He was a man who spoke of civic duty and God's law from the steps of the courthouse, his voice smooth as polished wood, while his chief instrument, a hard man named Jeb Crow, enforced a different kind of law in the shadows. Crow was the judge's unofficial executioner, a man whose presence was a threat all on its own. The town wore a brittle piety, its citizens quick to quote scripture in the church pew and just as quick to turn their backs on a neighbor in need on the street. They whispered about the widow Whitlow, how she kept to herself, how she worked like a man, how her brother was running wild. It was the slow, casual cruelty of people who had little else to occupy their time. As Cole walked the dusty street, he felt the town's hypocrisy like a change in the air pressure. He saw the tired faces of the men, the pinched expressions of the women. He saw the way they deferred when one of Judge Pike's ranch hands rode through, their eyes cast down. This was a town held in a quiet stranglehold. He stopped in front of the post office, tacked to the wall. Faded and peeling was an old wanted poster. The sketch was of a man long dead or disappeared, but it was the names listed beneath it that held Cole's attention. The Vultures Gang. His eyes scanned the list of aliases and known associates until they landed on one Ephraim Pike, Judge Pike's younger brother. A jolt went through Cole, a cold confirmation of a long-held suspicion. Ephraim Pike had been there the day Cole's own brother, Asa, had been killed in a payroll ambush. The official report called it a stray bullet. Cole knew better. Asa had been silenced, and now the trail had led him here, to the heart of the Pike family's domain. The blood debt was not just for Asa anymore. It was for the truth. Later, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, a sound drifted through Dust Haven. It was the lonely, aching voice of a harmonica, a simple, mournful tune that seemed to speak of long roads and lost things. Nora stood on the small porch behind the diner, a bucket of gray water in her hand, and listened. The music seemed to catch on the wind, a thread of sorrow weaving through the desolation. She could not see who was playing, but she knew it was the stranger. The sound was as spare and stoic as he was. In the center of the parched yard in front of her diner stood a single, stubborn mesquite tree. Its branches were twisted, its bark scarred, but its roots ran deep, clinging to life in the baked, cracked earth. It was the only thing that offered shade, the only thing that seemed to push back against the sun. Earlier that day, after the wind had tried its best to rip the leaves from its limbs, she had retied the red silk scarf she used to hold back her hair. It was a simple, practical thing, but against the endless palette of brown and beige, the scrap of red was a defiant slash of color. It was her flag, a small signal that she was still here, still fighting. As the last notes of the harmonica faded into the twilight, Nora looked at the tree, a silent kinship passing between them. They were both survivors, rooted in a place that gave no quarter. The next morning, the stranger returned. He sat at the same table and ordered the same thing. Nora served him, their exchange as brief as the day before, but as she cleared his plate, he spoke. "That is a good tree," he said, nodding toward the mesquite visible through the dusty window. Nora paused. "It has seen better days." He looked from the tree to her, his gray eyes unreadable. "It is still standing." There was a weight to his words that went beyond a simple observation about a tree. He was speaking of something else, of the nature of endurance. For the first time, Nora felt a flicker of something other than wary professionalism. It was not warmth, not yet, but a shared understanding, a recognition. She found herself replying, "It has deep roots." He nodded, a flicker of a smile touching the corner of his mouth before vanishing. "Those are the only kind worth having." He placed his coins on the table, the extra nickel sitting squarely on top of the rest. He left without another word. Nora watched him go, the screen door swinging shut. She picked up the nickel, its metal cool against her skin. It was not a payment for coffee or stew. It was, she was beginning to realize, a payment for something else entirely. In a town built on shifting sands, the stranger with the sad eyes and the hook-shaped scar was offering something solid. Even if she did not yet understand what it was, she only knew that his presence, like the distant train whistle, was a new sound in the monotonous song of Dust Haven, and it promised change, for good or for ill. Cole Maddox had come to Dust Haven to collect on a blood debt. The debt had a name, Ephraim Pike, and a date. The day his brother Asa had taken his last breath on a rocky pass in the Sangre de Cristos. Cole carried the proof in his saddlebags, a sworn deposition from a dying outlaw connecting Ephraim to the ambush. He had followed that name like a map, and the map had ended here, in a town that was little more than a personal kingdom for Ephraim's brother. Judge Luther Pike, the collection, he knew, would not be simple. Justice, like water, was a commodity here, and the judge controlled the wellspring. The trouble, when it started, did not come for him. It came for the boy, Jamie, a week prior. Jamie had traded a lame pony and 2 months of mucking out stalls for a spirited little mare from one of Judge Pike's ranch hands. It had seemed a fair deal until the mare developed a cough and a listlessness that spoke of a deeper sickness. The ranch hand was gone, and Jamie, 16 and full of a young man's righteous fury, was convinced he had been cheated. His pride was stung worse than his pocketbook. Late in the afternoon, when the heat had baked the sense out of most men, Jamie slipped away from the diner. He made his way to the sprawling Pike Ranch at the edge of town, his heart hammering a rhythm of fear and determination. The stables were vast, smelling of hay and horse sweat and money. He found the pony he had traded away, looking hale and hearty in a clean stall. The injustice of it burned in his throat. He was just about to unlatch the stall door, his mind a foolish jumble of plans to lead the pony home, when a shadow filled the doorway. Jeb Crow moved with a predator's economy, his large frame blocking the only exit. A cruel smile played on his lips. He said, "Looking for something, boy." Jamie froze, his hand still on the latch. I was just looking at my pony." Crow chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Is that what you call it? This pony belongs to Judge Pike. Looks to me like you were stealing." He advanced into the stable, and the space suddenly felt small and airless. Jamie backed away, his bravado evaporating. "No, sir, it was a bad trade. The mare he gave me is sick." Crow's smile vanished. He grabbed Jamie by the front of his shirt, the fabric twisting tight against the boy's throat. He lifted him effortlessly, slamming him back against a rough-hewn stall post. Wood splinters scraped Jamie's back. The man's face was close, his breath soured with chewing tobacco. "You listen to me. You little whelp. You and your sister are a blight on this town. You think you can just walk in here and accuse one of my men. You think the law applies to trash like you." Jamie struggled, but it was like fighting a rock wall. Crow's grip was iron. He shook the boy, his head knocking against the wood. The world swam in Jamie's vision. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his anger. A voice, calm as a frozen river, cut through the tension. "Let the boy go." Crow turned, his hand still clamped on Jamie's shirt. Cole Maddox stood just inside the stable door, a silhouette against the blinding sun. He had not drawn his gun. His hands were loose at his sides. There was nothing overtly threatening about his posture, yet the very stillness of him was a warning. Crow sneered. "This is not your concern, stranger. This is Pike business." Cole took a slow step forward. "The boy says he was cheated. That sounds like a concern for anyone who believes in a fair trade. Now, I will say it one more time. Let him go." For a moment, Crow hesitated, measuring the man before him. Then, with a grunt of contempt, he shoved Jamie to the ground and turned his full attention to Cole. He flexed his hands, thick, calloused knuckles ready for a fight. "You have got a lot of nerve. Maddox, I know who you are. Been asking questions. You are a troublemaker." Cole's expression did not change. He said, "I'm just a man passing through." He moved with a speed that was deceptive. As Crow lunged, Cole sidestepped, his hand shooting out not to strike, but to grasp. He caught Crow's wrist, his fingers finding pressure points with practiced ease. He twisted. It was not a punch or a kick, but a simple, brutal application of leverage. A loud pop echoed in the stable as Crow's shoulder joint gave way. The big man bellowed in pain, his knees buckling. Cole held him there, his arm bent at an unnatural angle, his face a mask of agony. Cole's voice was a low whisper. "The next time you lay a hand on that boy, I will break more than your pride. Do you understand me?" Crow could only manage a strangled gasp of assent. Cole released him, pushing him away. Crow stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, his face pale with shock and fury. Just then, Nora appeared in the doorway, breathless from running. She had seen Jamie sneak off, her heart seizing with a premonition of disaster. She took in the scene at a glance, Jamie scrambling to his feet, Crow cradling his arm, and the quiet stranger standing like a stone wall between them. For the first time, she saw Cole Maddox not as a customer or a mystery, but as a force. He was a bulwark, a silent promise of protection that she had not realized she so desperately needed. She rushed to Jamie's side, her hands fluttering over him, checking for injury. "Are you all right? What happened?" Jamie, his face streaked with dust and humiliation, just shook his head. Cole looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers for a long moment. "It is over. Let us go home." The walk back to the diner was silent and heavy. That night, the whispers started. They slithered out of the saloon and bred in the pews of the church the next Sunday. The stranger, they said, was a violent man, a gunslinger looking for a fight. And Nora Whitlow, the poor widow, she was using him, trying to entice him to solve her problems. She was wrapping him around her finger to save her failing business. The town's piety was a thin veneer, easily scratched to reveal the judgment and suspicion beneath. Inside the diner, the air was thick with unspoken words. As Nora swept the floor, her movement sharp and angry, Cole sat at his usual table, cleaning his pistol with a quiet focus. His gaze drifted to a spot on the wall behind the counter. A small, dark circle in the wood. A patch, poorly made, failed to hide it completely. It was a bullet hole. He had seen holes like it before. He had made some of them himself. "That from the trouble a couple of years back?" he asked, his voice neutral. Nora stopped sweeping. Her knuckles were white on the handle of the broom. "Yes." "Her husband, Daniel." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Daniel had been a good man who believed in the law. He had signed a petition against one of Judge Pike's land grabs. A few nights later, 2 masked men had come into the diner. They said it was a robbery, but they had not taken much money. They had just left Daniel dead on the floor and a bullet hole in the wall as a message to the rest of the town. The threads of their 2 tragedies, his and hers, suddenly felt connected, woven together by the same dark hand. Cole finished cleaning his weapon, the metallic click of the cylinder spinning into place sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He looked at Jamie, who was sitting at the counter, staring at his hands. Then he looked at Nora. "I will not let the boy go back to their stables alone." It was not a boast or a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the weight of a solemn oath. A small, warm flicker of trust ignited in Nora's chest, an unfamiliar feeling she had thought long dead. She gave a single, sharp nod, accepting the promise. Judge Pike's response was swift and silent. He did not send Crow or his men. He used the weapons of a civilized man. The next morning, 2 notices were tacked to the community board. The first announced that, due to the prolonged drought, the fee for water from the Pike-owned community well was being doubled, effective immediately. The second was a formal, legal notice addressed to Nora Whitlow, informing her that the bank was calling in the outstanding loan on the Blue Coyote Diner. Payment in full was due in 10 days, or the property would be seized. Nora stood before the board, reading the crisp, black letters, and felt the ground give way beneath her. The diner was all she had left of Daniel, the only home Jamie had ever known. She had fought for 2 years to keep it, pouring her sweat and tears into its worn floorboards. Pike was not just trying to run her out of business. He wanted her land. There were whispers the railroad was planning a spur line through Dust Haven, and her diner sat on the most logical path. He was consolidating his power, sweeping the board clean of any pieces he did not control. She walked back to the diner, the notice trembling in her hand. The sun beat down, and the wind whipped dust into her eyes. The town seemed to hold its breath, watching her. This was how it was done in Dust Haven. Not always with a gun, but with a ledger and a pen, with the slow, inexorable squeeze of money and law, twisted to serve one man's greed. The choice was stark. She could run, take Jamie and what little she had, and disappear into the territory, another forgotten victim of a powerful man, or she could stay. She could stand on this small patch of dusty ground, with its stubborn mesquite tree and its memories, and fight. She looked up and saw Cole Maddox standing on the porch of the diner, watching her approach. His face was impassive, but she saw in his eyes a reflection of her own weary defiance. The question of staying or running was no longer hers alone. It had become theirs. In the days that followed, a quiet, fragile rhythm established itself against the loud, ticking clock of the bank's foreclosure notice. Life, Nora knew, did not pause for ultimatums. There were still potatoes to peel, floors to sweep, and a 16-year-old brother who ate like a plague of locusts. Cole Maddox settled into this rhythm as if he were a part of the landscape. Every morning, he took his corner table, and every morning, he left a nickel more than the bill. It became a silent, stubborn ritual between them. The first time it happened after the notice was posted, she tried to give it back. "I cannot take this," she said, her voice low. He did not look up from the brim of his hat as he settled it on his head. "I am not giving it. I am leaving it. There is a difference." The next day, she accepted the nickel without a word, but after he left, she took a piece of chalk and, on the small slate board where she listed the day's specials, she wrote in her neat, clear script, "Maddox, credit 5 cents. The day after, she updated it to 10 cents. It was her own quiet act of defiance. She would accept his help, his presence, but she would not be a charity case. He was a customer, and this was a business. The board was her ledger of pride. Cole saw it, of course. A faint smile touched his lips for a fraction of a second, but he said nothing. The silent accounting continued. Kindness, when it came, arrived not in grand gestures, but in the language of practical things. A loose sheet of tin on the diner's roof had been rattling in the wind for months, a constant, nagging percussion of decay. One afternoon, Nora heard the steady, solid sound of a hammer from overhead. She went out to see Cole on the roof, his back to the sun, methodically nailing the tin back into place before the next dust storm could tear it free. He did not ask. He just saw a thing that needed doing and did it. When he came down, his face streaked with grime. She handed him a glass of water. "She said I would have paid a man to do that, if I had the money." He drank the water in 3 long swallows. "Then I guess you got a bargain." He began spending time with Jamie, not lecturing him, but simply including him in his tasks. He showed the boy how to properly balance a saddle so it would not sore a horse's back, how to check a hoof for stones, how to listen to the subtle shifts in a horse's breathing. He taught him things a father would have. Jamie, who had been a tightly coiled spring of anger and shame since the incident with Crow, began to unwind. He started to walk with his shoulders back again, the shadow of the stable fading from his eyes. In return, Nora found herself teaching Cole. He drank his coffee black and strong, but he made it by simply boiling grounds and water together until it was a bitter sludge. One evening, as he prepared to make a small fire out back, she brought him a couple of eggs. "Here," she said, "for your coffee." He looked at her, confused. "You crush the shells," she explained, taking an egg and cracking it on the fire ring. "You put them in with the grounds. They pull all the grit to the bottom. Makes it clear. It is an old trail trick." He watched her, his focus absolute. It was the same way he watched a horizon, looking for meaning in small details. He tried it, and the coffee he poured was a clean, dark amber instead of a muddy brown. He took a sip, his expression thoughtful. Nora leaned against the doorframe, a small, weary smile on her face. Her world was shrinking, the walls of debt closing in. But in this small moment, there was a sense of peace. "You play that harmonica like you are trying to make the wind jealous," she said, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. "It is a lonely sound, makes a man thirstier." Cole looked at the harmonica in his hand, then back at her. "Maybe that is the point." "Well, it is bad for business," she countered, a hint of her old humor returning. He allowed a small smile. "Then you will just have to sell more lemonade. We both make a profit." The fragile peace was shattered a few days later. News came into town like a tumbleweed, bouncing from the saloon to the mercantile, whispered over fence posts. A small farmer named Jedediah Smith, who had a homestead a few miles out, was dead. Smith had been one of the few who had openly defied Judge Pike, refusing to sell his land, which held one of the last reliable springs in the county. The official story, delivered by Sheriff Miller with a face like stone, was that Smith had been cleaning a hunting knife and had tripped, falling on the blade. No one believed it. They had seen Pike's men, Crow among them, riding out towards Smith's land just the day before. The town's fear was a palpable thing, a foul taste in the back of every throat. And in their fear, they needed someone to blame, someone to watch. Their eyes turned to the stranger, to Cole. He was the one who had faced down Crow. He was the catalyst, the stone thrown into the stagnant pond. The next day, a package was waiting for Cole at the post office. It was a simple brown paper parcel, tied with twine, with no return address. He took it back to his small room at the boarding house. Inside was a wool jacket, worn and faded. Cole did not need to see the carefully mended tear on the left shoulder to know who it belonged to. It was Ace's. He could still smell the faint scent of pine and his brother's tobacco. Tucked into the pocket was a small, folded piece of paper. On it, 2 words were scrawled in a rough hand. "Ask Ephraim." The old grief, the cold rage he had learned to keep banked like embers, flared hot and bright. It was a message, a taunt from the past. Someone knew why he was here. Someone was pulling the strings, reminding him that the blood debt was real, and it was waiting. That night, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind, which had been a constant, nagging presence, began to howl. A sandstorm, born in the deep desert, was descending on Dust Haven. Nora and Jamie worked frantically to board the windows of the diner. The air grew thick, visibility dropping to a few feet. The world outside the windows became a maelstrom of screaming wind and stinging sand. Cole appeared at the door like an apparition, pushing his way in against the force of the wind and barring it behind him. "The roof!" he shouted over the din. "That patch I put on might not hold." As if on cue, a terrifying groan came from above them, the sound of wood straining against an impossible force. A fine shower of dust and splinters rained down on them. A beam was giving way. "Get under the counter," Cole yelled, grabbing Nora by the arm and shoving her toward the solid oak bar. He pushed Jamie in after her. They huddled together in the cramped, dark space. The diner, their fortress, felt as fragile as a matchbox. The building shook, and the roar of the wind was deafening. Suddenly, there was a sound like a gunshot, followed by the crystalline shattering of glass. The main window of the diner had blown in. A wave of sand and debris blasted into the room. Instinctively, Cole threw himself over Nora and Jamie, shielding them with his own body. A piece of the window frame, a heavy shard of wood and glass, slammed into his back. He grunted in pain but did not move. Nora was pressed against him, her face buried in his chest. She could feel the hard, steady beat of his heart against her cheek, a life rhythm in the middle of chaos. It was not a tender embrace. It was a desperate, unconscious act of protection. For a few terrifying moments, that was their entire world: the roaring wind, the darkness, and the solid, reassuring weight of the man shielding them from harm. Then, as suddenly as it began, the worst of the storm passed. The wind's scream dropped to a mournful moan. The world outside was silent, muffled by a new landscape of sand. Slowly, Cole pushed himself up. "Are you both all right?" Nora and Jamie could only nod, dazed. In the dim light filtering through the dust-choked air, she saw a dark line of blood soaking through the back of his shirt. "You are hurt." "It is nothing," he said, but his voice was strained. The aftermath of the storm was a strange, suspended silence. When they emerged from under the counter, the diner was a disaster. A thick blanket of sand covering everything, but the walls were standing. The roof, though damaged, had held. The next morning, an awkwardness hung between them, thick as the dust that still lingered in the air. The raw intimacy of the storm had breached their carefully constructed defenses. Nora found she could not meet his eyes. She was a woman who paid her own way, and she did not know how to repay a debt like this. To be so thoroughly protected, so completely shielded, left her feeling vulnerable in a way she had not felt since her husband's death. She was terrified of that feeling. Cole, for his part, was quiet and withdrawn. He had acted on instinct, the same instinct that had failed him the day Asa died. To care for someone was to open the door to losing them. He had sworn to himself he would not walk through that door again. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate distance. Two people who had stood too close to a fire and were now stepping back, afraid of the heat. That afternoon, as Cole was checking the hooves of his horse, Sheriff Miller approached him. The sheriff was a decent man, but he wore his compromise like a cheap suit. "Maddox," he said, his voice low, avoiding Cole's gaze. "I heard about what you did for the Whitlows during the storm." Cole just grunted in response, not stopping his work. "Look," Miller continued, his voice dropping even lower. "I know what this town is. I know how things work. What happened to Jedediah Smith? It was not right, but my hands are tied. My wife's family has land here. The bank, well, the judge has long arms." This was nothing Cole did not already know. He waited. "But a man ought to be able to trust the United States mail," the sheriff said, finally looking up, his eyes full of a weary frustration. "Pike has a man working in the post office. Has for years. Letters get lost, packages get delayed. Sometimes official papers get misplaced, replaced with other papers." He let the words hang in the air. It was a confession and a warning. It was also a key. Cole's plan to use the law against Pike depended on communication, on evidence reaching the right people. But if the channels themselves were corrupted, he was fighting a battle he could not win. The law was not just being bent in Dust Haven, it was being actively rewritten. One stolen letter at a time. This was not a fight he could win with a gun. It had to be won with the truth. And now he had a place to start digging. As the sheriff walked away, his shoulders slumped. Cole looked over at the Blue Coyote. The diner looked battered, wounded, but it was still there. And in front of it, the mesquite tree stood, its branches stripped of some leaves but otherwise unbroken. As he watched, Nora came out onto the porch. She looked up at the scarred tree, then reached up and untied the red silk scarf from her hair, with a slow, deliberate motion. She tied the scrap of bright color to one of the tree's lower branches. It fluttered in the breeze, a tiny, vibrant flag of survival against the washed-out landscape. It was a promise, a declaration. They were still standing, and Cole Maddox knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was standing with them. A community, like a desert plant, can have roots that are invisible but stubbornly deep. In the wake of the sandstorm, something in Dust Haven began to shift. It was not a rebellion, not yet, but a series of small, quiet gestures that amounted to a shared breath. Mrs. O'Hara, the town's seamstress, and a woman whose sharp needles were matched by her sharp tongue, appeared at the diner one morning with a stack of neatly mended aprons and towels. Nora tried to pay her, but the older woman waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense, child. A bit of thread is not going to break me. Besides, that man of yours fixed my fence gate last week. Not a word. Just did it. We are all just trying to keep the dust out." Caleb Ruiz, the blacksmith, a man of few words and powerful arms, stopped by and, without being asked, rehung the diner's sign, which had been knocked askew by the storm. He forged a new, stronger bracket for it, his hammer ringing a clear, defiant rhythm in the morning air. And on Sunday, Reverend Elias, a gaunt man with eyes that burned with a fierce, uncompromising faith, delivered a sermon on the parable of the Good Samaritan. He spoke of neighbors who look away and priests who pass on the other side of the road, and his gaze swept over the congregation, lingering for a moment on Judge Pike in the front pew before settling on Nora, who sat near the back with Jamie. It was a sermon that drew a line in the sand, and everyone in the church knew it. Cole felt the change and used the town's subtle shift in allegiance as a shield for his own inquiries. Acting on Sheriff Miller's warning, he began a quiet, methodical investigation. He spent hours at the freight office, ostensibly tracking a delayed shipment of coffee beans for Nora, while the clerk was distracted. Cole's sharp eyes scanned shipping manifests and delivery logs for the Pike Ranch. He found what he was looking for: discrepancies. Bills of lading for goods that never seemed to arrive, signed for by men whose names he did not recognize. One particular entry caught his eye: regular, large shipments of high-end whiskey and brandies, far more than even a man of the judge's appetites could consume. They were being delivered not to the main ranch house, but to a fortified stone warehouse on the edge of the Pike property. A place that was always guarded. It was a place where secrets, and perhaps a second set of books, might be stored. The drought, which had held the land in its fist for so long, broke with the sudden, biblical violence of a desert storm. The sky, which had been a merciless sheet of brass for months, turned the color of a deep bruise. Thunder rolled in the distant mountains, a low, guttural growl in the parched arroyo, a deep, dry channel carved by 1,000 forgotten floods. Jamie was checking a line of snares he had set for rabbits. He was trying to contribute, to bring some meat to the diner's larder. He did not see the wall of brown water, a churning, debris-filled monster unleashed by a cloudburst in the high country, until it was almost upon him. Nora, standing on the diner's porch, saw it. Her hand flew to her mouth, a scream catching in her throat. Jamie! The roar was deafening. Jamie was trapped, the steep, sandy walls of the arroyo offering no escape. He scrambled for purchase, but the dry earth crumbled beneath his fingers. Cole was out by the corral, and he saw it too. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. In a single, fluid motion, he was on his horse, kicking it into a desperate, lunging gallop, racing along the edge of the arroyo to get downstream of the boy. He leaned low over the horse's neck, his face a mask of grim concentration. He uncoiled the lariat from his saddle, the rope a familiar weight in his hand. He yelled, "Jamie, grab it." The water hit the boy, pulling him under, tumbling him in the churning chaos. He surfaced, sputtering, his eyes wide with terror. Cole cast the rope. The loop sailed through the rain-slashed air, a perfect, hopeful circle, and landed in the water just in front of Jamie. The boy's hand shot out, his fingers closing around the rough hemp. Cole spurred his horse, pulling it back from the crumbling edge, the powerful animal digging its hooves in, straining against the terrifying weight of the flood. For a heart-stopping moment, it was a battle of muscle and rope against the raw, indifferent power of nature. Nora watched, her heart a frozen stone in her chest, unable to breathe, unable to look away. Slowly, agonizingly, Cole dragged the boy from the main current toward the shallower side of the wash. When Jamie was close enough, Cole vaulted from the saddle, never letting go of the rope, and plunged into the thigh-deep water. He grabbed Jamie's collar, hauling him the last few feet onto the muddy bank. They lay there for a long moment, gasping for air, drenched and shivering, the floodwaters raging just feet away. Then, Nora was there, scrambling down the slick bank, her face a mess of tears and rain. She fell to her knees beside Jamie, her hands checking him for injuries, her voice a choked whisper of his name. When she was sure he was whole, a great, shuddering sob of relief escaped her. She looked at Cole, who was pushing himself to his feet, mud and water streaming from him. And then she did something she had not done in 2 years. She reached for someone. She threw her arms around Cole's neck, burying her face in his wet, mud-stained shirt, and held on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had tried to wash away. It was not a kiss, not a lover's embrace. It was the desperate, clinging hug of a survivor, a raw, unconscious expression of gratitude and terror that went deeper than words. Cole stood rigid for a second, surprised by the contact. Then his own arms came up, holding her steady, his hand resting for a moment on the small of her back. Later, back in the warm, dry kitchen of the diner, the roles were reversed. Cole's hands and arms were scraped and raw from the rocks and debris in the water. Nora filled a basin with warm water and gently began to clean the cuts. Her touch was light, her movements efficient, but there was a tremor in her hands she could not control. "You are a reckless man, Mr. Maddox," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You could have been killed." He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the far wall. It would not have been the first time. She paused, dabbing a cut on his forearm. She looked up at his face, at the hard lines around his mouth and eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He did not reply immediately, a muscle working in his jaw. "My brother, Asa, he was the careful one, never took a foolish risk in his life. He is dead." It was the most he had ever said about himself, a small, cracked window into the pain he carried. It was an offering, a piece of his story given in exchange for her touch, for her gratitude. She understood. She finished bandaging his hands in silence, the quiet in the kitchen a language all its own. The town's divisions grew sharper. Judge Pike, seeing the small gestures of support for Nora, decided to make a grand one of his own. He made a public offer to the church council to fund a brand new roof, a generous donation to replace the one damaged in the recent storms. It was a clear and public attempt to purchase the minister's silence, to wrap his own authority in the cloak of piety. Reverend Elias refused. In a terse letter to the council, he wrote that the house of God was not for sale, and its roof should be mended by the hands and contributions of the entire congregation, not by the questionable generosity of one man. 2 nights later, a volley of rocks shattered the windows of the parsonage where the Reverend lived with his wife. It was a message, delivered under the cover of darkness. The next morning, Nora walked across the dusty street, a pot of her best beef and vegetable soup in her hands, its steam fragrant in the cool air. She did not need to say a word. The act of bringing food, of offering comfort in the face of violence, was a declaration of where she stood. That same afternoon, Cole rode out to a high bluff that overlooked the Pike Ranch. He lay on his belly, his rifle resting on a flat rock, and watched the comings and goings in the yard below. For a long time, he saw nothing of interest. Then, Jeb Crow emerged from the main house. He stood in the open, stretching his arms, his back to the bluff. He was a perfect target, an easy shot. Cole's fingers settled on the trigger, the cold metal of familiar and terrible comfort. A single, simple action, and a large part of Nora's troubles would be over. It would be the old way, the way of revenge, the way that had left his brother dead and his own soul scarred. He thought of Asa. He thought of Nora's touch as she bandaged his hands. He thought of Jamie, pulled from the flood. He was fighting for them now, not just for the ghost of his brother. And they deserved more than another killing. They deserved justice. With a deep, steadying breath, he lowered the rifle. He had made a promise to himself, a promise to seek the truth in the light, not in the shadows. He would not break it now. That night, by the flickering light of a single lamp, he wrote in a small, leather-bound journal. He did not write about the investigation or the flood. He wrote a letter to Asa, the words filling the page in a tight, controlled script. "I could have killed one of them today," he wrote. "It would have been easy, but it would not have been right. I gave you my word I would find the man who did this, and I will, but I will not become him to do it. I will bring the debt into the light. I will pay it with the truth. I hope you can understand." A fragile domesticity had settled over the diner. One evening, Jamie watched as Nora refilled Cole's coffee cup for a third time. He said, a teasing grin on his face, "I have never seen you give anyone a third cup of coffee. Nora, not even Sheriff Miller." Nora did not miss a beat, turning from the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand. "That is because you, little brother, are a bottomless pit who inhales my cooking without a word of praise. Mr. Maddox, at least, knows how to say thank you." The comment brought a rare, faint blush to her cheeks and a quiet smile to Cole's face. 2 days before the bank's deadline, the answer came. Cole had used a small portion of his dwindling funds to send a carefully worded telegram to a former Pinkerton contact in the territorial capital. It had been a long shot, a search for any official records pertaining to Ephraim Pike. A lone rider delivered the reply. Cole unfolded the thin piece of paper. The message was brief. Re Pike, Ephraim, deceased. December 1890. Official cause fall from horse. Record sealed by judicial order. L. Pike presiding. Cole read the words once, then twice. A cold, hard clarity washed over him. He had been hunting a ghost. Ephraim Pike had been dead for nearly a year. The blood debt had not died with him. It had been transferred, inherited by the very man who had sealed the records and buried the truth, the man who held the mortgage to Nora's diner, who controlled the town's water, who had murdered Jedediah Smith and tried to buy the church. The target was no longer a dead outlaw. It was Judge Luther Pike, and he was very much alive. The telegram felt like a ghost's whisper in Cole's hand. The words were simple, stark, and they upended his entire world. Ephraim Pike, deceased. December 1890. He had been chasing a dead man. The blood debt he had carried for months, a cold, hard stone in his gut, was for a man already in the ground. Official cause, fall from horse. Cole crumpled the paper in his fist. A fall from a horse was a convenient, common and often untrue way to die in the territory. And the final line of the telegram was the key. The twist of the knife record sealed by judicial order. L. Pike presiding. Luther Pike had not just inherited his brother's land and cattle. He had inherited his sins. He had wiped the slate clean, burying Ephraim along with any inconvenient truths about payroll ambushes and murdered men. The blood debt had not vanished. It had simply changed its address. It belonged to the judge now. The man who sat like a spider at the center of Dust Haven's web. The man who was even now trying to crush the life out of Nora Whitlow. The mission had a new name, a new face. And this target was far more dangerous than a long-dead outlaw. The next morning, the bank delivered its final word. It was not a polite reminder, but a formal notice of seizure, delivered by a nervous young clerk who could not meet Nora's eyes. The language was cold and absolute. 10 days. She had 10 days to produce the full amount of the loan. An impossible sum, or the Blue Coyote and the land it stood on would become the property of the Dust Haven Savings and Loan. President Judge Luther Pike. The warning had become a death sentence. Nora stood in the middle of her diner, the paper in her hand, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt the true, crippling weight of despair. It was a physical thing, pressing the air from her lungs. She looked at the familiar, worn tables, the counters she scrubbed every night, the bullet hole in the wall that was a constant, grim memorial. This was her life, her history, and it was being stripped away from her with the stroke of a pen. The town watched. They saw the notice posted on the diner door. They saw the slump in Nora's shoulders. They whispered their pity, but they offered no help. To stand with Nora was to stand against the judge, and no one had that kind of courage. Judge Pike's own brand of courage was of a different sort. He did not come himself. He sent Jeb Crow. The big man filled the diner's doorway 2 days later, his bulk blocking the light, a smug, contemptuous look on his face. "The judge is a reasonable man, Mrs. Whitlow," Crow said, his voice a low rumble. "He knows these are hard times. He feels for your situation." Nora stood behind the counter, her hands flat on the wood, her knuckles white. She said nothing. "He has a proposition for you," Crow continued, savoring the moment. "He needs a new head cook up at the main ranch. Good food, a clean room to sleep in, a respectable position for a woman like you. You take the job. He forgives the debt on this place, wipes it clean. He is a generous man." The offer hung in the air, thick and foul. It was not an act of mercy. It was an act of conquest. He did not just want her property. He wanted her submission. He wanted to parade her defeat before the entire town. The proud widow brought to heel, serving meals in the house of the man who was destroying her. Everyone in town would know she had knelt. They would see her as the judge's property, just like the land, just like the cattle. Nora looked past Crow, her gaze fixed on the mesquite tree in the yard, its red scarf a defiant speck of color. She thought of Jamie, of the home she had fought to keep for him. She thought of her husband's memory. A slow, cold anger began to burn away her despair. She straightened her spine. She looked directly at Crow, her eyes clear and steady. "Please inform the judge that I am not for sale. I have my diner, my mesquite tree, and my brother. That is reason enough not to move to hell." Crow's smug expression curdled into a sneer. "Suit yourself. 10 days." He turned and left, the screen door slamming behind him with an air of finality. The story of her refusal spread through town faster than a prairie fire. It was the talk of the mercantile, the saloon, the livery. The widow Whitlow had spat in the judge's eye. It was a brave act, a foolish one, and everyone waited to see how the judge would respond. They did not have to wait long, but the response came from an unexpected quarter. That afternoon, Cole Maddox walked to the center of the town square, a dusty, open space between the courthouse and the saloon. He stood there for a moment, letting the town's attention gather. Doors opened. Men stopped their conversations. Faces appeared in windows. When he had their eyes, he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried in the still, hot air with an absolute clarity. "My name is Cole Maddox," he said. "I came to this town to collect a blood debt." A murmur went through the small crowd. "I am not here to collect it from a dead man," he continued, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "I am here to collect it from a living one, and he will pay it with the truth." He said nothing more. He turned and walked back toward the diner, leaving a stunned, buzzing silence in his wake. He had not named the judge, but he did not have to. He had taken Nora's private struggle and made it a public declaration of war. He had drawn his own line in the sand, right beside hers. The immediate result was Jeb Crow. He met Cole by the town's cattle pens, his bad shoulder apparently healed enough for his purposes. Several of Pike's ranch hands were with him, forming a loose, menacing circle. "You have got a big mouth, Maddox," Crow snarled. "You come into our town, you stir up trouble, you make threats. I think it is time someone taught you some manners." He took off his gun belt and threw it to one of his men. "Just you and me, no guns." Cole looked at him, then at the men surrounding them. He slowly, deliberately, unbuckled his own gun belt and handed it to a startled Jamie, who had followed him out. "Stay back, boy," he said softly. The town was watching again. From a safe distance, they saw Crow charge, a bull of a man, his fists like hammers. They saw Cole meet him not with brute force, but with a cold, calculating precision. He moved like a dancer, sidestepping Crow's wild swings, using the man's own momentum against him. He landed 2 short, sharp blows to Crow's ribs that made the big man grunt in pain and surprise. Crow lunged, trying to wrap his arms around Cole in a bear hug. Cole dropped low, driving his shoulder into Crow's midsection. The air went out of Crow in a great whoosh. As the man staggered, gasping for breath, Cole delivered a final, precise punch to the point of his jaw. The sound of the impact was sickeningly loud. Crow's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed in the dust like a felled tree, unconscious before he hit the ground. Cole stood over him for a moment, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. The ranch hands stared, their bravado gone. They had expected a brawl. They had witnessed an execution. Cole looked at them, his gray eyes hard as flint. Anyone else? They backed away, shaking their heads. They picked up their fallen leader and hauled him away. Cole retrieved his gun belt from Jamie, his expression unreadable. He had proven a point. He was not just a hired gun. He had a strength that was controlled, a power that knew when to stop. But his public defiance had attracted another kind of attention. That evening, as he was leaving the livery stable, a stooped, shadowy figure slipped out from an alley and pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand before scurrying away. Cole opened it under the light of a lantern. The note was crudely written. "Judge Pike is a problem. $500 for a solution. A permanent one." Cole stared at the words. $500 was a fortune. It was more than enough to pay off Nora's loan, to buy them a ticket out of this town, to start a new life somewhere else. It was the easy way out, the dark way, the way of the assassin. Not the lawman. He thought of his promise to Asa's memory. He thought of paying the debt with truth, not with another body. Without a moment's hesitation, he tore the paper into small pieces and dropped them into a horse trough, watching the ink blur and run in the murky water. He walked back to the diner. The lamps were lit inside, casting a warm, golden glow. Nora was on the porch, sweeping away the day's accumulation of dust. She looked up as he approached. The tension of the day was still in her eyes, but so was something else, a quiet strength. She held out her hand. In her palm was a small, neat stack of nickels. "Your peace of mind money," she said. "I have been keeping track." Cole looked at the coins, then at her face. "I told you I was not giving it. I was leaving it." "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I do not need it anymore. I am starting to find my own. I am starting to feel peace of mind just having you near." Her words were a balm on the raw wounds of the day. They were a confession, a declaration of trust that was more valuable than any amount of money. He did not know what to say. In his world, words were for gathering facts or giving orders. They were not for this. He looked at her, standing there in the soft lamplight, her hair a bit disheveled from the long day, her face smudged with flour. The red scarf she had tied to the mesquite tree had come loose, and she had used it to tie back her hair again. Against the deepening twilight, the splash of color was vibrant, alive. He reached out, his calloused, scraped fingers moving slowly, hesitantly. He did not touch her skin. He gently, almost reverently, touched the silk of the scarf. The fabric was soft, a startling contrast to the hard, rough world they lived in. Nora stood perfectly still, her breath catching in her throat. His touch was a question, a discovery. A small, sad smile touched Cole's lips. "In the middle of the desert," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion he could not name. "Someone put the dawn on her head." He let his hand drop. The moment stretched, fragile and beautiful, before it was broken by Jamie calling from inside that supper was ready. But the space between them had changed. It was no longer just an alliance of necessity. It was something more, something worth fighting for, something worth staying for. Cole's public declaration created a fissure in the town's foundation of fear. Through that crack, a small, secret alliance began to grow. The meeting took place in the back room of Caleb Ruiz's smithy, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron, the only place in town where a raised voice would be swallowed by the clang of a hammer. Sheriff Miller was there, his face etched with the anxiety of a man betraying a powerful master. Reverend Elias came, his Bible tucked under his arm like a shield. Mrs. O'Hara arrived with a basket of mending, her sharp eyes missing nothing, and Caleb Ruiz, the blacksmith, stood by his anvil, a silent, powerful presence. They listened as Cole laid out his plan, his voice low and steady. He spoke of the fortified warehouse, the suspicious whiskey shipments, and his belief that the judge's real ledgers, the ones that chronicled his bribes and extortion, were kept there. "We need those books," Cole said. "A copy, at least, something concrete to send to the federal marshal in Yuma, something that will force their hand." "It is suicide," Sheriff Miller said, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. "That place is guarded day and night. The safe inside is military grade." The Reverend spoke, his voice surprisingly strong. "The Lord helps those who help themselves. Sheriff, we have turned a blind eye for too long while our neighbors' fields were stolen and our water was sold back to us. Our sin is one of silence." "But how do we get in, Mrs.?" O'Hara asked, her practical nature cutting through the debate. "We are a blacksmith, a preacher, a lawman on a short leash, and a seamstress. Not exactly a team of safecrackers." "I am," Jamie said from the doorway. All heads turned. Nora stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her face a mixture of fear and pride. She had forbidden him from coming, but he had insisted. "I am not a safecracker," Jamie corrected, stepping into the room. "But I can get a job. They are always looking for boys to sweep up and haul crates at the warehouse. I am small. People do not notice me." Nora's grip on his shoulder tightened. "No, it is too dangerous." Jamie looked at her, his eyes pleading. "I have to do this. Nora, for Dad, for us, I will not let them say we did not fight back." Cole looked at the boy, then at Nora. He saw the same stubborn fire in both of them. "He will not be alone. We will be watching." Reluctantly, Nora nodded. The plan was set. Jamie, with his honest face and unassuming manner, secured a job at the warehouse the next day. For 3 days, he did nothing but sweep floors and stack crates, making himself a familiar, invisible part of the scenery. On the 4th day, he saw his chance. The warehouse manager unlocked the heavy iron safe to retrieve some papers, leaving the large, ornate key resting on his desk while he was distracted. Jamie, pretending to chase a rat with his broom, stumbled near the desk. In his palm, he had concealed a small, flat piece of clay, softened with oil in a single, swift motion. He pressed the clay over the key, capturing a perfect impression of its intricate teeth. He slipped the clay into his pocket, his heart hammering against his ribs. The first piece of the puzzle was theirs. As they worked on their desperate plan, nature itself seemed to conspire against them. The brief relief of the storm was forgotten as a heat wave descended, sucking the last vestiges of moisture from the air. The sun was a malevolent white eye in a bleached sky, the heat so intense it warped the view down the main street into a shimmering mirage. Vultures began to circle high above the town, lazy, patient black specks against the endless blue. They were a constant, silent omen, a reminder that the desert was always waiting to claim its own. The pressure of the ticking clock, the oppressive heat, and the circling birds frayed the nerves of the entire town, stretching them taut like a piano wire. One night, long after the diner had closed, Cole and Nora sat on the back porch, seeking a breath of air that was not baked and stale. The heat had not broken with the sunset. The moon was a pale sliver, offering little light. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. Finally, Cole spoke, his voice rough. He told her about Asa, about the ambush, about the single moment of hesitation that had cost his brother his life. "I was supposed to be watching his back," Cole said, his gaze lost in the darkness. "I was a step too slow. I saw the glint of the rifle barrel in the rocks, but I froze for just a second. That is all it took. He died because I was not fast enough." The guilt was a raw, open wound in his voice. Nora listened, her heart aching for him. When he was done, the silence returned, heavier this time, filled with his pain. Then she spoke, her own voice quiet and full of a sorrow she had never shared with anyone. "Daniel, my husband, he did not die in a robbery. He died because he believed in the law. He had gathered signatures, proof that Pike's men were diverting water from the small ranchers. He was going to send it to the territorial newspaper. He thought if he brought it all out into the light, people would have to listen. He believed the law was for everyone." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Pike's men came that night. They wore masks, but I knew it was not money they wanted. They tore up Daniel's papers, made him watch. Then they killed him. The sheriff at the time? He called it a robbery gone wrong. Everyone knew the truth, but everyone was too scared to say it. My husband died because he trusted a law that had already been bought and sold." They sat there in the dark, two survivors adrift on a sea of grief. They had found each other in the wreckage of their pasts, their separate tragedies forged by the same cruel hand. In that shared vulnerability, they were no longer just allies. They were equals in suffering, their jagged, broken pieces fitting together in the darkness. Nora looked at Cole's hands, resting on his knees. She saw the pale, hook-shaped scar on his wrist, a permanent mark of his own violent past. Without a word, she went inside and came back with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. She knelt before him and gently took his hand. He did not pull away. She dipped the cloth in the water and began to softly clean the old scar, as if she could wash away the memory that had made it. Her touch was incredibly gentle. He watched her, his throat tight. He had never let anyone touch the scar. It was a private penance. Her simple act of tenderness was a new and terrifying language. When she was done, she did not let go of his hand. She simply held it, her small, work-roughened hand resting in his. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her face, her features softened by the dim moonlight. He slowly covered her hand with his other, sandwiching it between his own. "Close enough to hear each other's hearts," she whispered. It was more than enough. The trap, when it was sprung, was cruelly efficient. With the key impression, Caleb Ruiz had managed to forge a working copy, but before they could use it, Pike made his move. Sheriff Miller, his face ashen, arrived at the diner with two of Pike's men. "Nora, I'm sorry. There has been a complaint. A pistol was stolen from the Pike warehouse yesterday. An eyewitness saw Jamie leaving the premises around the time it went missing." "It is a lie," Nora cried, her hand flying to her chest. "Jamie was here with me all afternoon." One of Pike's men produced a pawn ticket from a shop in the next town over. It was for a Colt revolver, the same model as the one reported stolen. The ticket was signed with a crude forgery of Jamie's name. "He is just a boy," Miller said, his voice miserable. "But the judge has issued a warrant. I have to take him in." They took Jamie away, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. Nora was left standing in the doorway, her world collapsing for the second time. It was a perfect trap. A boy with a grievance, a stolen weapon, a forged ticket. No one would believe Jamie's word against the judge's. Just as her knees were about to buckle, Cole stepped up beside her. He had been out checking the perimeter and had seen the sheriff's arrival. His face was a thundercloud. He looked at the retreating figures, then back at Nora. "It is not over," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He and Sheriff Miller met in the middle of the street an hour later, as the foreclosure agent from the bank, a man with a weasel's face and a sheaf of papers, was striding toward the diner. "This is a legal seizure," the agent announced, a smug satisfaction in his voice. "The 10 days are up." "Not quite," Cole said, stepping in front of him. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat, holding up a piece of paper. "A telegram. It is from the office of the federal judge in Yuma." The agent sneered. "What is this?" "It is an official notice," Miller said, his voice gaining strength. "It seems certain business practices in Dust Haven have come under federal scrutiny. The notice states that any property seizure or foreclosure presided over by a local magistrate currently under said investigation is to be suspended, pending the outcome of that investigation." The color drained from the agent's face. He looked from the telegram to Cole's granite-hard expression. He knew he was beaten. He snatched the paper from the sheriff's hand, read it, and swore under his breath. Without another word, he turned and stalked back toward the bank. Cole had sent his own telegram to Yuma days ago, a detailed account of his suspicions, a shot in the dark that had just hit its mark. The victory was short-lived. That night, a primal fear woke Nora from a restless sleep. A strange, orange light was flickering against her window. The smell, smoke. She threw open her bedroom door. The back of the diner was on fire. Flames were licking up the dry wooden walls, greedily consuming her life, her home. "Jamie!" she screamed, running to her brother's small room. But he was already up, his face pale with terror. Through the window, they could see figures on horseback riding away, their face hidden by the darkness. But there was no doubt who they were. It was Crow's answer. If the law would not work, fire would. Nora grabbed blankets from the beds, shoving them at Jamie. "The well! Get them wet!" They ran outside, their lungs filling with acrid smoke. The back wall was now a sheet of fire. It seemed hopeless. But then, other figures emerged from the darkness. Caleb Ruiz, carrying 2 massive buckets of water as if they were toys. Mrs. O'Hara, her face grim, organizing a bucket brigade from the town well. Reverend Elias, his sleeves rolled up, his face smudged with soot, working alongside them. The town, the silent, watching town, was finally fighting back. Cole was a whirlwind of controlled motion, directing the fight, tearing burning planks from the walls with his bare hands, his face a mask of furious determination. Nora worked beside him, her fear replaced by a cold, hard rage. They were a chaotic, desperate army, fighting for this small piece of ground. Slowly, miraculously, they began to win. The flames faltered, then shrank, hissing and spitting in protest. As the first pale light of dawn broke over the horizon, the fire was out, leaving behind a smoldering, blackened scar on the back of the diner. Nora stood, leaning on a shovel, her body aching, her clothes soaked and filthy. She looked at the devastation, at the smoke still rising in the gray light, but the diner was still standing. Beside it, the mesquite tree was scorched, its leaves blackened. The red scarf she had tied to its branch, now a charred, melted ruin. But the tree itself, its stubborn, gnarled trunk, had not fallen. She looked at the faces around her, her neighbors, their faces grim but determined in the morning light. She looked at Jamie, who was staring at the damage, his youthful face aged with the night's terror. And she looked at Cole, who was watching her, his own face a mask of soot and exhaustion. "From now on, we stop defending," she said, her voice hoarse but clear as a bell. Cole walked to her side, his eyes never leaving hers. He nodded, a single, sharp gesture of agreement. "We bring the fight into the light." The fire had taken a piece of the diner, but it had given something back, a spine of hardened resolve. The blackened boards were a testament not to defeat, but to the fact that they had survived. The smoke had cleared, and in the stark light of day, the battlefield was clear. They were done waiting for the next blow to fall. Market Day was the pulse of the county. It was the one day when the town of Dusthaven swelled with ranchers, prospectors, and a rough-and-tumble crew of railroad workers who came in for supplies and whiskey. The air was thick with the smell of livestock, frying onions, and nervous energy. It was the perfect stage. Cole chose the town's main cattle pen, a dusty, circular arena of judgment where bulls were broken and fortunes were made or lost on the price of a herd. It was a place for public spectacles, and he intended to give them one. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, a crowd gathered. They were drawn by a strange sight. Mrs. O'Hara, her face set like granite, standing on a crate and holding up a large, crudely painted banner made from a bedsheet. On it, in bold, black letters, were the words, "The law is not a rich man's rope." People pointed and whispered, their curiosity piqued. Cole stepped into the center of the pen, holding a sheaf of papers. He was flanked by Caleb Ruiz, whose silent, powerful presence was a deterrent in itself, and Reverend Elias, whose grim piety lent a solemn air to the proceeding. Nora and Jamie stood near the edge of the crowd, Nora's heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Cole let the crowd settle, his calm gaze sweeping over them. He began to read. He did not shout. He spoke in a clear, measured voice, the voice of a man presenting evidence. He read from the copied pages of Judge Pike's secret ledger, the one they had risked so much to obtain. He read dates, names, and figures. To Silas Croft, Cole read, for services rendered in the matter of the Jedediah Smith homestead, $50. He paused, letting the name hang in the air. People murmured. They all knew Smith was dead. He continued, his voice relentless. To the foreman of the Territorial Survey crew, $100. For the adjustment of railroad right-of-way markers. At that, a man stumbled out of the crowd. He was a railroad surveyor, his face flushed with cheap whiskey and a guilty conscience. "It is true," he slurred, pointing a trembling finger at the courthouse. "Pike paid us to move the stakes, to cheat honest men out of their land for the spur line. He said it was for progress." The man's confession, raw and unprompted, sent a shockwave through the crowd. This was no longer just the stranger's accusation. It was the truth, spoken in a voice they recognized. Reverend Elias stepped forward, holding his Bible aloft. He did not speak of damnation. He spoke of water, my friends, my neighbors. His voice rang out, clear and strong. How many of you have had the price of water from the community well raised without reason? How many of you have been forced to pay more just to keep your families and your livestock from thirsting to death? He raised his own hand, slowly at first, then with more confidence. Hands went up all across the crowd, one by one, then in dozens. Soon, it seemed nearly half the town stood with their hands in the air, a silent, powerful indictment. They were no longer just watching. They were testifying. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the rising tension. Judge Luther Pike rode into the square, followed by Jeb Crow and a dozen hard-faced men with rifles resting in the crooks of their arms. They were not ranch hands. They were hired guns, their eyes cold and empty. Pike reined in his horse, his face a mask of controlled fury. "This is an unlawful assembly," he declared, his voice booming with judicial authority. "You are being incited to riot by a known troublemaker. I order you to disperse immediately, by the authority vested in me by the laws of this territory." His hired men raised their rifles, the muzzles pointing toward the crowd. A gasp of fear went through the people. They began to back away, the brief flicker of courage dying in the face of cold steel. But Sheriff Miller stepped forward. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he stood between the gunmen and the townspeople. He did not draw his weapon. He simply stood there, a lone figure in a worn coat. He looked at Judge Pike, his expression one of weary, profound disappointment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he unpinned the tin star from his chest. He held it for a moment, then stooped and placed it gently on the ground, in the dust of the street. "It is not my law anymore. Judge," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the square. The act was a thunderclap. The town's one symbol of official law had just declared itself bankrupt. In the ensuing chaos, as Pike stared in disbelief at the badge in the dirt, Jeb Crow slid from his horse and moved like a snake through the edge of the crowd. He appeared at Nora's side. She flinched, but he just leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper in her ear. "Your husband was a fool," he hissed, his breath hot and sour. "He died because he signed a debt marker I put in front of him, thought it was a petition, signed his own death warrant. He did." The world tilted on its axis. The noise of the crowd faded to a dull roar in Nora's ears. Daniel, her Daniel, who could barely read, who had trusted so completely, who had been so proud to make his mark on what he thought was a document for justice. He had not been a martyr. He had been tricked. He had been led to the slaughter like a lamb. The final, brutal piece of the puzzle slammed into place, and the pain of it threatened to shatter her. She swayed on her feet, the world going gray at the edges. A hand, strong and steady, gripped her arm. It was Cole. He had seen Crow approach, had seen the look on Nora's face. He did not ask what was said. He did not need to. He leaned in, his own voice a low, urgent counterpoint to Crow's poison. "Nora, look at me." She forced her swimming eyes to meet his. "Do not let him do it," he said, his voice fierce. "Do not let him write your name on fear one more time." His words were a lifeline. She grabbed onto them, pulling herself back from the edge of the abyss. She took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. A single, sharp movement. The tears were there, burning behind her eyes. But she would not let them fall. Not here, not in front of them. Just then, a new rider entered the square. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, riding a lathered horse. He wore the official cap of the United States Postal Service. He paid no mind to the armed standoff, his eyes scanning the crowd with a singular purpose. "I have an official federal dispatch for Judge Luther Pike," he called out. He rode straight to the judge, who stared at him. Nonplussed, the rider handed him a long, sealed envelope bearing a government crest. Pike tore it open. As he read, the color drained from his face. The mask of authority crumbled, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. It was a federal subpoena, ordering him to appear before a grand jury in Yuma to answer questions regarding conspiracy, mail fraud, and extortion. It was effective immediately. The law he had so expertly twisted to his own ends had finally caught up with him, but it was a bigger, stronger law, one that he could not buy or bury. The night was quiet, but it was the heavy, charged silence before a storm. The subpoena had scattered Pike's men and sent the judge into a fury of seclusion, but no one believed it was over. In the dim light of the diner's kitchen, Cole gave Nora his instructions. "Lock the doors after I leave. Keep Jamie inside. If I am not back by sunrise, you take the boy and you go to the train station. Do not wait. Do not look back. Just go." He stood at the threshold, ready to leave. Nora stood before him, her hands twisting in her apron. The space between them was electric, filled with everything they had not said. This could be the last time they saw each other. The air was thick with the need for a kiss, for some physical promise to hold on to through the long, dark night. But the moment was too heavy, too fragile. A kiss would be a promise of a future they might not have. So they just stood there, their eyes locked, saying everything and nothing at all. Finally, Nora broke the silence, her voice attempting a lightness it did not feel. "Do not go getting yourself killed. Mr. Maddox, I do not have the money to build you a monument." A faint, tired smile touched Cole's lips. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her forehead. "Fair enough. It is already costing you a fortune just to raise one stubborn man." He turned and melted into the darkness, leaving her alone on the porch, the echo of his words a small, warm coal in the cold furnace of her fear. The message was a single, folded piece of paper left on a hitching post, delivered by a boy who vanished before he could be questioned. The writing was a crude scrawl, but the meaning was clear. It challenged Cole to a final meeting at Red Butte Canyon, a jagged scar in the earth a few miles from town. It was a place of shadows and echoes, a natural amphitheater for a killing. It was signed with a single, arrogant letter C. Cole knew it was a trap, but he also knew it was one he had to walk into. Crow and Pike would not rest until this was finished. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with clouds that refused to break. A dry, restless wind snaked through the canyon, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. It was a saw-toothed wind that seemed to get under a man's skin, setting his nerves on edge. Heat lightning flickered silently on the horizon, illuminating the towering rock formations for a split second before plunging the world back into a deeper darkness. Cole moved through the rocks like a ghost, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. His years as a scout had taught him the language of the night, the art of becoming one with the shadows. He saw Crow before Crow saw him. The big man was standing near a narrow pass, outlined against the stormy sky, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He was waiting, confident. From his position in the rocks above, Cole had a perfect shot. He raised his rifle, the metal cool and solid against his cheek. He centered the sight on Crow's broad back. His finger tightened on the trigger. It would be so easy. A single, clean shot, and the man who had terrorized this town, who had whispered poison into Nora's ear, would be gone. It would be vengeance. It would be the old way. He thought of Asa. He thought of the letter he had written to his brother's memory, the solemn promise to pay the debt with truth, not with blood. I will bring it into the light. The words echoed in his mind, a ghostly reprimand. To kill Crow now, from the darkness, would be to break that vow. It would be to become the very thing he was fighting against. With a deep, steadying breath, he lowered the rifle. He stood up, deliberately stepping on a loose piece of shale that skittered down the rock face. The sound was loud in the charged silence. Crow spun around, his rifle coming up, his face a mask of surprise and fury. "Looking for me?" Cole asked, his voice calm as he stepped out from the cover of the rocks, his hands empty and open at his sides. Crow's surprise twisted into a sneer. "Fool! You should have stayed hidden." He dropped his rifle and pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt. He charged, not with the wild abandon of their last fight, but with a focused, brutal intent. Cole met him, not with a weapon, but with his body and his wits. It was a savage dance in the dust. Crow was stronger, a battering ram of muscle and rage, but Cole was faster, smarter, his movements a fluid economy of motion. He dodged and weaved, turning Crow's lunges aside, letting the big man exhaust himself against the unyielding defense. Crow slashed with the knife, the blade whistling through the air, inches from Cole's face. Cole caught the man's wrist, twisting it with a surge of strength. The knife clattered to the ground. For a moment, they were locked together, two forces of will, straining in the flickering lightning. Cole drove his knee into Crow's side, breaking his grip. He spun the larger man around, catching him in a chokehold from behind. Crow thrashed, his powerful body bucking, but Cole's grip was like iron. The big man's struggles weakened, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. Cole could feel the man's life in his hands. He could squeeze, just a little more, and it would be over. The temptation was immense, a dark whisper in his soul. "No," he grunted, the word torn from his own throat. "You are going to stand up in front of everyone. You are going to tell them everything." He released the pressure, intending only to disable him. But at that moment, a voice cut through the wind. "An excellent idea, though I am afraid he will not get the chance." Judge Luther Pike stepped out from behind a tall spire of rock. He held a pistol, and it was aimed directly at Cole's heart. Cole let go of Crow. Shoving him to the ground, he stood, facing the judge, his mind racing. He had walked into the trap perfectly. But then, another sound, the crunch of boots on gravel. From the mouth of the canyon, a group of figures emerged. Sheriff Miller was in the lead, his tin star pinned back on his chest, a shotgun held at his side. Beside him was Caleb Ruiz, carrying a blacksmith's hammer that looked more like a weapon of war than a tool. Reverend Elias and Mrs. O'Hara were there, their faces grim and determined. A small army of the town's silent majority had found its voice. Pike stared, his composure cracking. What is the meaning of this? Just then, a high, piercing whistle cut through the air. From the other end of the canyon, another group appeared. It was Jamie, and behind him, a dozen railroad workers, their faces hard and grim, carrying pickaxes and sledgehammers like makeshift weapons. The judge was surrounded. His authority, which had seemed as solid as the rock around them, had crumbled to dust. A small, trembling man was pushed forward from the town's contingent. It was the judge's accountant, a man named Abernathy, who clutched a leather-bound ledger to his chest as if it were a prayer book. I have it. Judge, Abernathy stammered, his voice thin with terror. The real ledger, the one with your signature on every page. He held it out. On the cover was a small, dark smudge of ink. As Jamie stepped into the light of the lanterns they had brought, he held up his hand. On his palm was an identical smudge, a faint, telltale mark from the oiled clay he had used to copy the safe key. The proof was absolute, a direct line from the boy's courage to the judge's crimes. Pike's face was a ruin. He was trapped, his empire of fear collapsing around him. In a final, desperate act of cowardice, he lunged. He did not lunge at Cole or the sheriff. He moved toward the edge of the crowd, where Nora had just arrived, her face pale with worry. He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him, his arm clamped around her throat. He pressed the cold muzzle of his pistol to her temple. "Everyone stay back," he screamed, his voice shrill with panic. "I will kill her, I swear I will." The crowd froze. A collective gasp of horror went through them. Nora was rigid with terror, her eyes wide, fixed on Cole. Cole did not hesitate. He slowly, deliberately, placed his own pistol on the ground. He raised his empty hands, showing he was not a threat. He took a single step forward. "Let her go. Pike," he said, his voice calm, reasonable. "It is over." "I will not go to prison," Pike shrieked, his grip tightening on Nora. Cole took another step. He looked not at the judge, but at Nora, his eyes holding hers, trying to anchor her in the swirling chaos. He saw the terror in her face, the way her body trembled. He had to break the spell of fear. He had to reach her. And so he did the one thing the judge would never expect. He used a joke as a weapon. "You know, Judge," he said, his voice conversational, "you have just made a terrible mistake. You have kidnapped the worst cook in the entire territory." Pike stared at him, confused. "It is true," Cole continued, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "She never gives me enough pepper. Never." The absurdity of it, the sheer, ridiculous domesticity of the complaint in the face of life and death, was a crack of light in the darkness. A strangled sound escaped Nora's throat. It was not a sob. It was a snort of laughter. The sound was small, but in the tense silence, it was a thunderclap. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a flash of her old, stubborn spirit. She was no longer just a victim. She was Nora Whitlow, who was being criticized for her cooking while a gun was held to her head. The spell was broken. In that single, distracted moment, Caleb Ruiz moved. He did not run. He took 3 powerful strides and swung his blacksmith's hammer in a short, brutal arc, not at the judge's head, but at his gun hand. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the pistol flew from Pike's nerveless grasp. The judge screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. Sheriff Miller was on him in an instant, pulling a struggling Nora free and shoving the judge to the ground, the satisfying click of handcuffs echoing in the canyon. It happened in a heartbeat. As the judge went down, Crow, forgotten in the chaos, scrambled to his feet. He saw Jamie standing nearby, his face triumphant. With a roar of pure hatred, Crow pulled a second, smaller knife from his boot and lunged, not at Cole, but at the boy. Cole moved on pure instinct. He threw himself in front of Jamie, a human shield. He felt a white-hot, searing pain in his left shoulder as the blade sank deep. He grunted, stumbling back, but he did not fall. Caleb Ruiz was there, his hammer ending Crow's attack before it could go any further. And then the sky opened. The dry lightning and teasing wind finally gave way to a sudden, torrential downpour. The first rain of the season fell in thick, heavy sheets, soaking them all in an instant. It plastered their hair to their heads and turned the thick dust of the canyon floor into a dark, running mud. It washed the blood from Cole's shoulder and the grime from their faces. It was a baptism, a cleansing. As the sheriff and the railroad men dragged a weeping Judge Pike and a dazed Jeb Crow away, the townspeople began to whisper. "He came to collect a blood debt," one man murmured to another, his voice filled with awe. Reverend Elias watched as Nora rushed to Cole's side, her hands fluttering over his wounded shoulder, her face a mask of anguish and love. The Reverend looked at the two of them, standing together in the pouring rain, and he added his own quiet postscript. And he might just leave with a tender, wild, and forever kiss, if the good Lord allows it. The dawn that followed the storm was born of water and silence. The rain had softened to a fine, persistent drizzle, and the air smelled clean, washed of its perpetual dust. In the gray light, the Blue Coyote Diner stood wounded but resolute. The back wall was a blackened skeleton of charred timbers, a grim testament to the night's violence. But the main structure was intact, its roof holding strong against the sky. And in the front yard, a small miracle. The scarred, scorched mesquite tree, which had endured drought and fire, had responded to the life-giving rain. On its blackened branches, tiny, almost imperceptibly small green shoots were unfurling, a stubborn, defiant declaration of life in the face of destruction. It was a promise of rebirth, not just for the tree, but for the town itself. The change in Dust Haven was palpable. The fear that had held the town in a state of suspended animation had been broken. As the morning wore on, people began to emerge from their homes, not to stare or whisper, but to act. It started with Caleb Ruiz, who arrived with a wagon loaded with fresh milled lumber, his face grim but his purpose clear. Then came others, men with hammers and nails, women with buckets and brushes to scrub the soot from the remaining walls. Mrs. O'Hara arrived not with mending, but with a huge basket of freshly baked bread, which she distributed with a gruff, no-nonsense kindness. They worked together, a clumsy but determined army of neighbors. They spoke little, but a new understanding passed between them. They looked each other in the eye, and the shame that had kept them isolated and silent for so long began to dissolve in the shared labor. They were rebuilding more than a diner. They were rebuilding the very idea of their community. Around mid-morning, Sheriff Miller walked to the center of the square, to the spot where he had laid his badge in the dust. He stooped down, picked it up, and wiped the mud from its surface with his thumb. He held it up for all to see. He said, his voice carrying in the quiet air, "A law only has as much authority as the people are willing to give it. If the law belongs to the people again, then I will wear their star." He pinned the badge back on his chest. There was a moment of silence, and then a smattering of applause, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, more confident. It was the sound of a town taking its first breath of free air. Inside the diner, the world had shrunk to the space of a small, quiet room. Cole sat on a chair in the kitchen, stripped to the waist, while Nora tended to the knife wound in his shoulder. The cut was deep, and her hands trembled as she cleaned it with carbolic soap and water. The small, intimate act was charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the injury itself. Every light touch of her fingers on his skin was a question, every shared breath an answer. Cole watched her, his face pale beneath his tan, his usual stoicism eroded by pain and exhaustion. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, a stray lock of damp hair clinging to her cheek. She was so focused, so fiercely gentle, that his heart ached with a feeling he had no name for. He broke the silence, his voice a low, rough whisper. "I came here to collect a blood debt." His voice trailed off, the words heavy with the weight of his long journey, the quest that had defined him for so long. Nora paused, her hand still. She slowly looked up, her eyes dark with emotion. "Meeting his—" She finished the sentence for him, but she changed it, twisted it from a statement of the past into a plea for the future. "And leave with a tender, wild, and forever kiss if you stay." The last three words were the key. They were the heart of the matter, the question upon which their entire world now balanced. He had won. His brother was avenged, and the guilty were being brought to justice. He was free to go, to ride away into the sunset. Another chapter of his lonely life closed. But her words offered him something else. Not an ending, but a beginning. He did not answer with words. He reached up with his good hand and gently touched her cheek, his thumb stroking away the single tear that had escaped and traced a path through the soot on her skin. They met on the diner's front porch a little while later. The rain had almost stopped, leaving the air cool and fresh. The world seemed new, washed clean. The charred wood of the porch railing was a stark reminder of the battle they had fought, but they stood in the ruins, facing each other, and the only thing that mattered was the space between them. She stepped toward him, rising on her toes, and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or desperate relief. It was a slow, deep, and certain kiss. It was warm and real, a quiet affirmation of everything they had survived, of everything they had become to one another. It was a promise, made without a single word, to build a new life on the foundations of the old. It was long and tender and held a hint of the wildness of the land around them. And in its gentle certainty, it felt as if it could last forever. The moment was perfect, fragile, and it was shattered by a loud, exasperated voice from the doorway. "Hey, is the diner closed or what? Some of us are starving out here." They broke apart, laughing, the sound soft and genuine. Jamie stood there, a lopsided grin on his face, trying and failing to look annoyed. The three of them, standing together on the damaged porch, looked for all the world like a family. The lightheartedness lingered, later, as Cole was settling back into his chair, a clean bandage on his shoulder. He caught Nora's eye. "You know, I do not believe I have paid my 5 cents for peace of mind today," he said, a teasing glint in his eye. Nora smiled, a real, unguarded smile that lit up her whole face. "From now on, Mr. Maddox, we will bill you yearly." The wheels of a more formal justice began to turn. A federal marshal arrived from Yuma, and with Sheriff Miller at his side, formally took Judge Pike into custody. The judge, stripped of his power and his hired guns, was a diminished figure, a blustering, terrified old man facing a future in a federal prison. Jeb Crow was charged with the attempted murder of a minor and the arson of the Blue Coyote, his reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with the clank of iron shackles. Abernathy, the accountant, in exchange for his testimony and the delivery of the judge's real ledgers, was promised leniency. The town's legal cancer was being cut out, but the town's moral healing had to come from within. The following Sunday, Reverend Elias stood before his congregation, his face filled with a humble and profound shame. He did not preach from the Bible. He spoke from the heart, He apologized to his flock for his silence, for his cowardice, for allowing the shadow of one powerful man to eclipse the light of their shared faith. He asked for their forgiveness. And then he announced that the church would be taking up a collection, not for a new roof, but for a new community, well, to be dug on common land, owned by everyone, controlled by no one. It was a declaration of independence. Nora, for her part, paid her own debts in her own way. The day after the fire, she lit the stove in her damaged kitchen. She took out her largest stock pot and began to cook. She made a huge, fragrant batch of the rich beef soup that was her specialty. When it was ready, she carried the pot out to a makeshift table in front of the diner. A line began to form. A line of the same people who had whispered about her, who had watched her struggle in silence. She ladled the soup into their outstretched bowls, and as she did, she looked each of them in the eye. She stood tall, her back straight, her expression open and unafraid. She was no longer the reclusive widow, hiding from their judgment. She was Nora Whitlow, the heart of their town, feeding her community, nourishing the tentative, new roots of their shared future. A few weeks later, in the quiet hush of early morning, Cole found Nora standing under the mesquite tree. The sun was just beginning to spill its pale gold over the distant mesas, and the air was cool and sweet. The tree, once a symbol of her solitary endurance, was now dotted with the vibrant green of new leaves, a living testament to their shared survival. The sounds of hammers and saws had been replaced by the gentle rhythm of a town getting back to its life. The diner was nearly whole again, its new lumber smelling of pine and promise. Cole stood before her, his hat in his hands. He looked different in the soft morning light. The hard lines around his eyes, carved by years of looking for trouble on the horizon, seemed to have softened. He was no longer a man just passing through. He was a man who had found a place to stand. He did not have a velvet box or a diamond ring. He held out his hand, and in his palm lay a simple band of dark, hammered iron. Caleb Ruiz had forged it in his fire, shaping it with the same strength and care he had used to rebuild their town. "Nora," he said, his voice low and steady, "all my life, I have been settling debts. It is the only thing I have ever been good at." He looked at the ring, then back at her, his gray eyes filled with a raw, honest vulnerability. "I owe you a lifetime of peace," he said, "if you will take it." It was a proposal phrased in the only language he truly knew, the language of accounts and balances. He was offering to settle the debt of fear and violence he had brought into her life with a lifetime of quiet mornings and safe nights. Nora looked at the simple iron ring, then into his eyes. She saw the man he was, the good, the broken, and the brave. She had fallen in love not with a hero, but with a stubborn, quiet man who knew how to fix a roof and how to stand between her and the darkness. She reached out and gently closed his fingers over the ring, then placed her own hand over his. "I do not need you to pay me a debt. Cole Maddox," she said, her voice soft but sure, filled with the wisdom of a woman who had learned the difference between a transaction and a covenant. "I just need you in the kitchen when it is raining, and I need you to watch Jamie when I am scolding him, so he has someone to roll his eyes with." She was not accepting a payment. She was accepting a partner. She was choosing a life not of quiet safety, but of shared, ordinary moments. A life of love. He slid the iron ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Their wedding was not a grand affair. It took place that same afternoon, on the newly rebuilt porch of the Blue Coyote Diner. Reverend Elias, his face shining with a joy that seemed to transform his stern features, performed the small ceremony. Jamie stood beside Cole, shifting from foot to foot, his young face a comical mixture of pride and embarrassment. Mrs. O'Hara and Caleb Ruiz stood as witnesses, their presence a quiet, solid blessing. The rest of the town kept a respectful distance. They did not crowd or intrude, but they watched from their doorways and windows, their face filled with a gentle, proprietary happiness. This wedding did not just belong to the couple, it belonged to all of them. It was the final stone set in the foundation of their new community, a public declaration that love and courage had taken root in the hard soil of Dust Haven. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, a cheer went up from the street, a warm, genuine wave of celebration. In the weeks and months that followed, the changes in Dust Haven became as permanent as the landscape. The community, well-funded, started by the Reverend, overflowed with contributions. The well was dug, deep and true, and its sweet, clear water was free to all. A team of federal auditors descended upon the Dust Haven savings and loan, and the web of Judge Pike's financial corruption was slowly, methodically unraveled. The threat of unjust foreclosures and land grabs vanished, and the people of the town finally owned their own futures. One bright, clear afternoon, Nora took a new red silk scarf, a splash of brilliant, hopeful color, and tied it to a branch of the mesquite tree. It was not the same defiant flag she had flown before. This was a banner of victory, a small, bright testament to the courage it takes to not just survive, but to build a home. That evening, as the sun began to set, Cole sat on the porch, a harmonica in his hand. He put it to his lips, and, for the first time, the music that emerged was not a lonely, mournful tune of loss and longing. It was a lively, simple folk melody, a song of hearth and home, of a journey ended and a new one begun. The sound was a surprise and a gift. Inside the diner, the slate board behind the counter had been wiped clean. The old, stubborn accounting of nickels owed for peace of mind was gone. In its place, in Jamie's best cursive, was a new entry under the heading, New Debts. It read, Mr. Maddox owes one dance, every Saturday night. Cole saw it when he came inside. He read the words, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. He looked at Nora, who was watching him, a playful light in her eyes. "That is one debt," he said, his voice full of a quiet, happy certainty, "that I intend to spend the rest of my life paying." Justice, they had learned, was not the sound of a gunshot in a lonely canyon. It was the sound of hammers rebuilding a neighbor's wall, the murmur of a town council meeting where every voice was heard. And love was not a sudden, consuming wildfire. It was a small, steady flame you tended to every day, a quiet warmth that kept the darkness at bay. They had made their choice, a simple, two-word declaration that had become their anchor against all the harsh winds of the world. We are staying. The sunset poured a golden, honeyed light over Dust Haven. Smoke rose from the chimney of the Blue Coyote, a straight, clean plume that no longer smelled of ash and fear, but of baking bread and roasting meat. Cole stood on the porch, his arm around Nora's shoulders, and they watched the day come to a peaceful end. From inside, Jamie's voice, full of the easy confidence of a boy who knows he is home, called out, "Soup is on." And they went inside, because home is the sound of someone calling you to supper. He had come to this place to collect a blood debt. He stayed to pay a life debt, with a tender, wild, and forever kiss each time the desert wind changed seasons. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more people.